Hey everybody, we're continuing our unit on Baroque art and we're starting in Italy. We've taken a look at architecture, sculpture. It's time to look at some painting with our first artist, Caravaggio. Caravaggio was a real trailblazer, famous for his fiery personality and a lot of trouble he got into, even while he was quite successful, which kind of spelled his own doom. But I'll leave that to the documentary I'm going to have you watch as a supplement to understanding who he was, what his motivations were, and perhaps what got under his skin and ultimately led him to get into big trouble. Have you ever heard of an artist who was a murderer? Well, that was Caravaggio. So he is one interesting guy. He's also the master of the brilliant description of very moving art that connects with the viewer, art that hones in beautifully on transitory moments where former sinners become saints, where they leave one kind of a path filled with pursuits that are considered sinful and immoral, and these transformation moments become something that Caravaggio is brilliant at honing in on. And of course he does it with plenty of Baroque theatricality and drama. How does he bring that forward? Well, let's take a look at his first painting here, Calling of St. Matthew, from the turn of the century, 1597 to 1601. This is a painting that it talks about one of these saints. The saint you may be familiar with, St. Matthew, of course, one of the authors of the Gospels, very dedicated follower of Jesus. Wasn't always that way. At one point, he was known as Levi, and he was a tax collector in Rome. Now, that doesn't mean he was, a bureaucrat, a government worker, like working for the IRS nowadays. No, in those days, it was almost like being a mafioso. He's kind of shaking down people who really can't afford to pay as much as was being asked from them. So some, sin involved with abuse of power, maybe some extortion, that kind of thing. So that's why he was an unsavory type once upon a time. Okay, so what we're seeing in this scene here is a destination that Caravaggio probably was very well acquainted with. He was a man who supposedly enjoyed his beverages. It looks like the setting is a tavern. And what you see here, again, is a group of people gathered around a table. And they're counting money on the table. That's what's happening here. So again, alluding to greed, the extortion of money, that kind of clue that what they're doing isn't honest work. And then in a minimalistic setting, right? There's not a big emphasis on any kind of distracting setting with lots of, kind of classical world architecture like we might have seen in the Renaissance. It's very minimalistic with just a partial window in our view. The stage, though, is compressed. So we've been seeing a lot of artists do this, and it's very common in Baroque period, too, to have kind of this theatrical look with a shallow stage that we almost feel like we're in an adjacent table watching what's going on here. And what's going on here is that everybody's looking up toward the right-hand side of the painting. And it's there two gentlemen have entered the space here, entered the tavern. One, we can partially see a face, but it's still in shadow, and the other we can't see quite as clearly. You can see, though, a very prominent illuminated gesture, right? And we've talked about the power of gesture going back to Leonardo and Michelangelo, right, and during the Italian High Renaissance. Well, this gesture, this finger extended, happens to be repeated when this gentleman here is pointing to himself, like, who, me? Well, what's happening here is Jesus has come into this tavern with St. Peter, and he's essentially calling, as the title indicates, calling St. Matthew to the faith, to be one of his followers. And of course, that's the path he would go on to great accomplishment doing. But it's interesting that Caravaggio makes the choice to fully illuminate Matthew here. You can see that what Caravaggio is known to do is use this almost like theatrical spotlighting, like something you would see at a concert or a live play or musical, right, where you have lighting technicians nowadays using electrical lighting to kind of showcase key moments in a play or a performance, like a solo, that kind of thing. Caravaggio comes up with this idea of using spotlighting. So it's this high contrast lighting between where the darks are very dark and the lights are very light. That is a term called tenebrism that I've written out on our Canvas page for you. That is a characteristic of Caravaggio's art, but it's going to be a characteristic we'll see in a lot of Baroque art. It adds theatricality, right? And what's interesting is that he's chosen to have it bypass. The light doesn't even really illuminate Jesus, who's usually the VIP, the star of the show, right? He's the A-lister, if you will, of any religious theme art. And instead, it goes over him, illuminates the hand a bit, but focuses on Matthew the sinner. So again, what we find with Caravaggio is an interest in sinners and this moment, this split-second moment of conversion that's dramatic, that's theatrical, that's enthralling, where Levi becomes Matthew the saint. Now, another thing that's a characteristic of a Caravaggio painting is that he paints everyday relatable people. Whereas before, we've looked at a lot of faces that were relatively idealized. They felt, of course, that especially religious subjects, you shouldn't make, Jesus or Mary or anyone in their retinue unattractive, right? You want them to be appealing to your audience. Well, Caravaggio, he grew up poor. He grew up on the streets then he moved to the streets of Rome and kind of had to pull himself up by his own bootstraps to become a successful painter. And so he understood the poorer districts of the country life in Italy or the, poorer districts of Rome. He understood who the audience for these artworks were, and they were the masses. They weren't the, the nobility or, high-ranking members of the clergy, that kind of thing. And so his audience he understood, and he wanted the faces that people looked at in his religious art to be relatable, not to be, the type of face that's going to get, the cover of People magazine's most handsome individual, right? But it's a face that's everyday. That's a face you would encounter, in your day-to-day life that's relatable. And by making his subjects unidealized and relatable, it helps the viewer connect to them as well. All right, moving on here, let's take a look at another painting by Caravaggio here. I'm going to make myself disappear here. And I think I've done that. Okay, the Caravaggio, Conversion of St. Paul is our next painting here from 1601. So this one's very similar. Here at the turn of the century, you start to see Caravaggio embrace even a smaller cast of figures. So what he does is he's still using a shallow stage, but he's minimizing his cast to just kind of 3 figures here. There are 2 men and a horse, and that's it in the painting. So it concentrates the view on another story of another famous saint and his conversion to Christianity story. So Paul was, the story was that Paul was someone who tormented early Christians, persecuted them. So he was kind of a bad guy, going down a bad, immoral path, a sinful life, right, for a while. And then when he was traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus, in the Holy Lands, he was struck with a brilliant, blinding light. And what happened was that light was being emanating from Christ, from Jesus. And at that point, Jesus, called him to the faith. And so from that point forward, Paul was converted and became, of course, one of the part of the inner circle of Christ, if you will. So again, it's a moment where we're seeing the most dramatic moment of the story, where he is struck blind, literally blind for a while, and we see Paul. If you look at his eyes down here, they look a little strange. That's Caravaggio's way of showing this temporary blindness by this brilliant light. Now, we're still seeing this high contrast lighting, right, where the darks are very dark and we get this sort of spotlight effect. But keep in mind, now we have to sort of interpret that as divine light. We're not seeing Jesus here either. He is implied by that lighting that is washing over, particularly Paul as well. It's almost as if it's so split second and so dramatic in a very Baroque way, right, that the horse is the only one to kind of recognize what's going on, and it's lifted its foot, probably wondering what happened to its rider, and we see Paul at the bottom of the painting, flat on his back. It's almost as if the hoof kind of points, almost like a gesture, right? Like, look down here, there's the subject of the painting, there's Paul. And then Paul's arms form with some dynamic diagonals, which is very common in Baroque art as well. Again, dynamic diagonals they read dynamic, they read energetic, but his arms also form a V shape, and that's like a directional device taking us down to the face of this soon-to-be saint, right? Soon-to-be Saint Paul. What you find too here is, I guess, another face only a mother could love, right? And another everyday relatable face. But again, this horse's steward or attendant hasn't even realized himself what's going on when this incredible moment, this divine intervention that's transpired between Jesus and Paul. So another example of Caravaggio's style, again, a negation of a background completely in many of his works. We can't even see any details. It's dark, it's inky, but that amplifies the high contrast lighting. It amplifies the drama happening on that shallow stage. And again, some dynamic diagonals serve to bring energy, split-second action, and of course a directional device as well in this particular scene. All right, got one more painting for you very quickly, and I'll probably save that for my next video. All right, so stay tuned for that. It's another great Caravaggio painting.